Hello, everyone. Greetings from my home in Kien Swai this Saturday morning, a very, very special day for Cambodia and for Cambodians. This is a special seminar on the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia that was signed on this day, October 23, 30 years ago in 1991. It gave us democracy, it gave us fair and free elections, and it gave us this incredible document or set of documents that we together called the Paris Peace Agreements generally. So we're going to talk about them today in English. I've been conducting seminars and will continue to do so in the Khmer language, reading together the text of the actual agreements, four documents that form the agreements. But now I feel like I need to also do a condensed one in English for Cambodian Americans, for Cambodian Australians, for Cambodians in the diaspora, for Cambodian watchers, friends of Cambodia who do not know Khmer or know Khmer at that level. So this seminar is for you. And also, I'm interested, I was thinking that I should do one in English because there has been a gross misunderstanding in the international community. And of course, it impacts on the influencers, the Cambodian influencers, and the chatting the chatting class, I guess is what we call, who are always talking about Cambodia and with influence to pass on and create the narrative. There has been a gross misunderstanding that has been extremely costly for Cambodia and Cambodians. So I want to also address those issues in raising this Paris Peace Agreements in English. So let's start. We have a slide. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. We'll go slide by slide. It should take about an hour to an hour and a half. So this is a very condensed version, a survey, but also looking at the particular language of the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia. So we'll start the slideshow. Oh, but before we start the slideshow, let's take 30 seconds to grab some coffee, or many of you are probably outside Cambodia because this is in English. Go and grab a drink, a glass of water, pen or pencil. So let's put on the cover for 30 seconds while we go and grab coffee, and I need to send a few things as well. So let's meet in 30 seconds, okay? No longer than 30 seconds. See you in 30 seconds. Okay, let's start with this special seminar on the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia in English. We will start with the slide presentation or the PowerPoint presentation I prepared for all of us. Next. So when we speak about the Paris Peace Agreements, we are focusing on a time period that occurs in the 70s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. So those are the 3 decades, the events that led to the Paris Peace Agreements. And of course, the event or the time period that everyone assumes and focuses on is the Khmer Rouge regime period from April 17, 1975 to Christmas Day 1979, and it officially ends when Vietnam completely controlled Cambodia on January 7, 1979. So that's three years, 8 months, 20 days, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. A lot has written about it. There are films, there are plays, there are, of course, the documents which have been produced by the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, but will be controlled by this Hun Sen regime and will be housed in the Council of Ministers. All the documents, the electronic version and the paper, the actual paper documents. So that's a deep concern. But anyway, all to say, we know that one of the time periods that is addressed by the Paris Peace Agreements is the Khmer Rouge years, the 3 years, 8 months, 20 days from April 1979 to early January 1978, with the invasion by Vietnam occurring on Christmas Day 1978, but January 1979. And from January 1979 to effectively May 1993, when the UNTAC administered elections, the UN administered elections took place. So effectively, the Vietnamese military occupied Cambodia from the time it invaded in December 1978 to May 1993, even though the withdrawal of troops, the formal withdrawal of Vietnamese troops from Cambodia started to occur in 1989, and the Paris Peace Agreements, of course, occurred in October 1991, where basically the US, I'm sorry, not the US, the UN, the United Nations, administered Cambodia for a brief period of time, thus UNTAC, which is the acronym for the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia. So in showing this timeline, I want to address one major growth, what's the word? Understanding of the Paris Peace Agreements and the recent history of Cambodia, recent tragic history of Cambodia. So the focus has been almost, if not 100%, on the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. And since then, we have so much information. It was a closed communist regime. And the horror that occurred did occur. Cambodians murdered their own people, thus the term auto-genocide, because the term genocide didn't fit the situation. The Vietnamese had been pushed out, and all the other foreigners have been pushed out. Some who remained were either imprisoned and killed along with Cambodians. So thus the term auto-genocide was coined to create this very particular situation of Cambodians killing Cambodians. But what is not well known is the time period of military occupation by Vietnam, a hostile foreign power. Vietnam, as you know, shares a border with Cambodia, and over the years have been incurring and have been taking over territory of Cambodia. For example, what to Cambodians is Kampuchea Crown. It's a massive piece of land of 24, 25 provinces, the same size of current Cambodia, if not larger, have been completely swallowed up by Vietnam within the last century. I mean, within my older relatives' lifetime, and are within living memory of the older Cambodians, and of course prior to that as well. So when I say it's a hostile foreign power, there has been a consistent, continual repeating of history in land grabbing and land incursion into Cambodia. So, but as you know, almost no one, especially of the new generation, knows of this time period because of the lack of writings that are in the public domain that are easily accessible, because many of them are academic writings. And of course, it was a closed communist system. It was one closed communist system replacing another. And there is literally no book in the English language on this time period that is trustworthy or covers that time period at all. There are chapters that are in books are very, very expensive because they're out of print. There is one book called The Bamboo Wall, which focused on the K5 genocide. But that is out of print, and it was written in French. All to say, there is literally no writings in the public domain that are accessible to the public, except unless you want to research minutely, pointedly, with a sharp focus on this topic, and you're literally going through piles and piles of documents, and you have to make the personal visit to an actual library or have access to academic institutions that published or own these very, very obscure, difficult, and rare and scarce articles and writings on the time period. So the two main reasons why we don't have writings, or three, why we don't have writings on this time period. One, because the focus has been completely shifted and stayed on the Khmer Rouge years, understandably and also intentionally by actors who want it that way. And the second reason is because it's another closed regime, and the U.S. is tired of Southeast Asia because it had lost the war with Vietnam. It didn't want to think anymore about Southeast Asia. Only one or two major newspapers even covered Cambodia and during that time period, or mainland Southeast Asia, because of the exhaustion by the West, in particular by the United States, on mainland Southeast Asia, because of its recent history vis-a-vis Vietnam, and how and it lost that war. Excuse me a minute. And the third reason is, well, it's sort of, I've sort of put it together. It's a closed regime, so it's difficult to access, and US exhaustion, which means very little media attention was focused on Cambodia, and during this very, very dark period. So it intentionally gave cover for the crimes that are unknown, but that have been surfacing now through CIA reports, through very dogmatic and very Cambodian watchers who are intent in following through and monitoring the situation, like Professor Stephen Morris. I wouldn't say dogmatic, but just very doggedly pursuing the topic. And so we have him to thank for, along with a few others, now to cast light on this very impenetrable, another impenetrable dark period. The Khmer Rouge years, yes, but then now we have a lot of documents. The occupation years, which, as I've said, lasted from 12 to 14 years effectively. To this day, very, very few people understand or know about this period and the mass crimes, including legal genocides that occurred, because the focus has been completely on the Khmer Rouge, which gave cover to what happens afterward. The exhaustion by the United States, thus no media attention, and it's another closed regime. And of course, not in a period of social media. So thus the lack of knowledge of this time period. All to say, when we speak about the Paris Peace Agreements, it's not to address only the Khmer Rouge period. When it mentions recent tragic history of Cambodia, it's the 14 years of occupation. And during the decade, well, let's go to the next slide, because I think I will address this in other slides. Let's move to the next page. So the Paris Peace Agreements, which is this incredible set of 4 documents, unprecedented in the countries that took part, 18 countries, including all the superpowers, including all the 5 major permanent members of the UN Security Council, including the major organs of the United Nations system and the United Nations system as a whole. Excuse me. And the participation of senior officials and politicians, heads of states, the president of France, the Secretary General himself participated actively. And it all happened, the Paris Peace Agreements emerged out of the Cold War. It's set within the Cold War context. And as you know, the Cold War is a period of political tension between the free world led by the United States and the communist world then led by the Soviet Union. So it's basically, it divided the world into two main blocks: the Western bloc, the free, the liberal democratic countries represented by the United States, and the communist or the Eastern Bloc represented by the Soviet Union. There was also another portion of the world. It was the non-aligned movement, and it's mainly countries in the third world, and mainly in South America, where it was not aligned with the United States or with the Soviet Union. So it was its own grouping. But the Paris Peace Agreements for Cambodia emerged from this context. And the Cold War years, basically represented by the US and the USSR, the Soviet Union, it was an arms race. It was two superpowers competing in nuclear warfare, in all fields, in the economic fields, in the military fields, but it was represented by the arms race, basically nuclear power, missiles. We got, and NATO emerged out of that. NATO is the military alliance for the West, and the Warsaw Pact was created, and it's the military alliance for the East, for the communist states, Russia, the Soviet Union and its allies. And basically, there are two phases to the Cold War. The Khmer Rouge and the Soviet occupation occurred in the second phase, toward the second end of the Cold War years. The first phase of the Cold War years occurred immediately after. Let's go to the next slide. So there are two phases. The first phase of the Cold War years, generally, when we speak of the Cold War years, we're speaking about from the end of the World War II, or from 1947, March 1947, when there was what was known as the Truman Doctrine, to December 1991, when the Soviet Union completely dissolved into separate countries and there is no longer the USSR. And so that's when the Cold War completely ends. Some historians had put it earlier in 1989, but now it's understood to be December 1991, only 1.5 months after the Paris Peace Agreements were signed. So from the end of, effectively shortly after the end of Cold War, World War II, which ended in September 1945, but the beginning of the Cold War just started with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, March 1947. And the second phase, so the first phase, we're talking about the first phase ends in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when we talk about the Cold War, we're not talking about a global war where there were fightings all over, like World War III. There were fightings, there were shootings, but they were in regions. They were here and they were there, all over the world. One of the main political theaters later in the second phase was in mainland Southeast Asia, for example, the war between the U.S. and Vietnam spilling into Cambodia. But there were the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin blockade, there was the Korean War. Korea split into two countries, North and South, to this present day. There was a war between 1950 and 1953. So that's the first phase. The second phase occurred when there's tension between the two major communist powers. The Soviet Union, sorry, not Russia. There was no Russia. Russia was not a country. Russia was part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and China went head to head. And of course, and then it had its allies, or it had its satellites. The Soviet Union in mainland Southeast Asia had Vietnam, and and China had the Khmer Rouge as its satellite. And of course, these two communists are at loggerheads. And so that comprises the second phase of the Cold War. And thus, the setting, the geopolitical setting for the Paris Peace Agreements. And as you know, the Khmer Rouge emerged within the second phase, as well as the military occupation by Vietnam. And during this time of the Cold War years, generally speaking, there were a lot of independent movements and independent states in Africa. A lot of countries in Africa gained independence, freed itself from the yoke of colonialism. The same in Asia. The only two countries, as you know, in Africa and in mainland, in Asia, which never experienced colonialism. In Africa is Ethiopia, and in Asia it's Thailand. So I'll stay there. Okay, so that's the geopolitical context for the Paris Peace Agreements. Next slide. And the individuals who were prominent in ending the Cold War are the leaders of these two major powers who were represented the Cold Wars, the United States, represented by President Ronald Reagan, who won 2 terms, who was president from 1981 to 1989, the whole period of Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia. Of course, the occupation occurred before and after, but he was president during that whole time and during the whole decade of the 1980s. And as you know, during the whole decade of the 1980s, the UN system, and in particular, the major organs of the UN General Assembly, UNGA, the UN Security Council, UNSC, the UN Secretariat led by the Secretary General, UNSG. And during that time, it was Javier Perez de Cuellar, a Peruvian diplomat who recently passed away last year. He lived to be 100 years old. He was born in 1920 and passed away in 2020. Anyway, a major prominent figure in the Paris Peace Agreements. All to say, Ronald Reagan was a hated communist. As you know, during the Cold War years, the free world hated communists. There was paranoia as well about communism. But as you may heard, when the political theater was in mainland Southeast Asia, the fear was of a domino effect. You know, the domino games. If one fall, then it makes all the other countries fall. So that's why the U.S. Really intervene in mainland Southeast Asia and conducted the war with Vietnam, because there was North Vietnam communist and South Vietnam free, and it was trying to save South Vietnam from becoming communist, because if South Vietnam fall as a country to communism, then the fear that all the other dominoes, the other countries, will also fall to communism, the domino theory, the domino effect. Thus, the reason for the intervention of the United States in mainland Southeast Asia during that time period, the fear of communism, that it would all turn red in the region. And of course, the U.S.-Vietnam War spilled into Cambodia and created the Khmer Rouge. So that's Ronald Reagan, who hated communism, and he was instrumental in ending the Cold War. And his counterpart in the Soviet Union was Mikhail Gorbachev, who was Secretary General of the Communist regime, and the Communist USSR Communist Party from 1984 till I think 1991, when there was no longer the Soviet Union, when it dissolved as a country into many, many other countries. And that's how we got Russia, because it's the biggest one. It also replaced the Soviet Union as a permanent member in the UN UN Security Council. So that's Mikhail Gorbachev. The first female ambassador to the United Nations from the United States was my professor, Jean Kirkpatrick. When Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, he appointed Jean Kirkpatrick to be ambassador to the United Nations. And she was my ambassador, of course, years later, in 1993. And it was a small seminar of about maybe 40 individuals at Georgetown. And also she and I attended the same church in Bethesda, Fourth Presbyterian Church. But anyway, so I got to hear firsthand. I wish in hindsight I had more time to speak with her and had more knowledgeable questions to ask her. But I did have those memories dear memories to hold on to. But anyway, Jean Kirkpatrick, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, was there during the very beginning, the first few years of the military occupation of Vietnam. So you see, when you go into the UN website and look at its archives, its decisions or resolutions, they're called, by the UN by the UN General Assembly, by the UN Security Council, you see that the language is one against the invasion and the military occupation of Cambodia. Thus, the UN gave the seat to the Khmer Rouge rather than to the new regime with the Cambodian face of Hun Sen, but controlled by the 200,000 strong Vietnamese military. It was invasion that became long-term occupation with the fear that Cambodia will no longer exist, will be completely wiped out as a country. So that's the geopolitical context. So the UN for the decade that President Ronald Reagan was Ronald Reagan was president, and the first 4 years where his ambassador, my professor, was at the United Nations, Cambodia was a hot topic that was constantly on the agenda of the United Nations in the major organs, the three main ones, the UN General Assembly, the UN Secretariat, the UN Security Council. The next slide. When we speak about the Paris Peace Agreements, a term that we use generally, we refer to four documents, four official documents, which make up what we generally call the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia. The first is called the Final Act of the Paris Peace Agreements, which is a document of about three pages. And it basically describes the final day, October 23, 1991, of what occurred, who participated, all the countries, 19 countries, all the superpowers, all the members of the permanent, all the permanent members of the UN Security Council, and of course, all the members of ASEAN then, not the 10 members now, all the members of the ASEAN then, and of course, other countries as well. Japan, Australia, India. And so that's the first document basically is a description of what occurred, who attended, the countries we call states in international law, countries we call states. So when I use the word states in international law, it's countries, right? Countries are states in international law. So 19 countries, 19 states, and the individuals are dignitaries of the highest caliber from their respective countries. And of course, the whole UN system, including the top UN official, the UN Secretary General himself, Javier Perez de Cuellar, participated. And so basically, the first document, which is entitled aptly, the final act, the final event of what occurred, act not as in law, act not as in treaty or agreement, act as in what happened. The final act of the Paris Conference on Cambodia. So that's the first document, about 3 pages. The second document, which is the heart of the matter, and it's the longest, is about 21 pages in English. So read them. Please read the actual documents. They're not long. They're very, very interesting. The second document is entitled Agreements Regarding Concerning the Political, let me just read the actual title. I have to Agreement on the Political Settlement of the Cambodia Conflict. So this is the title of the second document, Agreement on the Political, I'm missing a word here. Agreement on the political settlement of the Cambodia conflict. Oh, that's right. Actually, it has a longer name. It has the word comprehensive. So let me. So this is a condensed name for it. So let me find the actual title. Yes, here it is. Agreement on a comprehensive political settlement of the Cambodia conflict. So the first title is Final Act of the Conference on Cambodia. The second, which is the heart of the matter and has the word agreement in it, which is contract. Agreement is a contract. It's legally binding. Now, the first document is also an official document of the Paris Peace Agreement, but there's no promise to do anything. So it doesn't talk about being legally binding on anybody. It's a description of what happened. So the second document, the word there is agreement on a comprehensive, and we're going to see how comprehensive it is, the amount of money poured into it, all the organs and the whole United Nations system almost as a whole were involved. Very, very comprehensive indeed. Agreement on a comprehensive political settlement of the Cambodia conflict. That's the second document, which is the heart of the matter, about 21 pages. The third document is entitled Agreement Concerning the Sovereignty, Independence, Territorial Integrity, and Inviolability, Neutrality, and National Unity of Cambodia. That's the third document. That's the title of the third document. Agreement Concerning the Sovereignty, Independence, Territorial Integrity, and Inviolability, Neutrality, and National Unity of Cambodia. It's also the heart of the Paris Peace Agreements. Document 2 and Document 3 are the heart of the Paris Peace Agreements. It has legally binding language. A party promises, commits to do something. The law can enforce that on that party. So that's what is legally binding. It has promises and commitments parties have made and are binding on them. And the fourth document is entitled, we go and big again, Declaration on the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction of Cambodia. This is only about a page and a half, 2 pages. So you can see that these four documents these four official documents form what we generally call the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia. And the first document is a description, no language that binds anyone to do anything. It's just a description. It expresses its concerns. It expresses, we'll go into it and we'll see some of the context or content of the document in a bit. And you can see that the second and the third documents, the core of the Paris Peace Agreements, have in its title agreement, which means a contract. It's a legally binding language. It's a treaty. Parties are committing themselves and the law can enforce that on the parties. So, and again, the first and the second agreement, the second document, speaks about the comprehensive political settlement. And the third document, in its title, and it's the longest title, and it details in the title what it's all about: the sovereignty, the independence, the territorial integrity and inviolability, the neutrality and national unity of Cambodia. And it's an agreement. Parties, the Cambodian parties, there are four of them, and the state parties, not witnesses, the parties, the countries who of the 18, not including Cambodia, who signed, were parties to the agreement. They're legally binding on those countries, this Paris Peace Agreement. Thus, it cannot be pushed aside by one Cambodian actor, for example, because it has involved the whole world, basically. Okay. And as we know, so the heart, just from the titles alone of the four documents, the heart of the Paris Peace Agreements, first and foremost, is to speak about Cambodian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and addresses foremost the foreign occupation of Cambodia. And of course, the other major topics of the Paris Peace Agreements, and we'll see the language in a little bit, are the elections, democracy, human rights, administered by the United Nations, what is known as the acronym UNTAC. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the previous slide. Can you make it big? Thank you. As you can see, the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia are in the four official languages of Chinese, English, French, and Russia. Those are the four official languages mentioned in the Paris Peace Agreements in the actual document itself. 5, Cambodia, but we never had an official translation. We never, to this day. And what I have prepared within recent days, it's not an official translation. I think it's very, very good because it took a lot of time. And plus, I understand both languages really well. And plus, it speaks to my educational background of politics and law. So it's for sure the only readable, accessible version in the Khmer language. The other document, the other version, the only one other version that exists, it's very difficult to read, very difficult to access, and there are parts where it's mistranslated. Let's go back and larger to this large. Notice that the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia are in the four official languages: Chinese, English, French, Russian, but it's also in Arabic. It's also in Spanish, and I think all the major languages in the world have translated. And these pages that I have called, they're from the website. It's from the UN webpage. This is what you see when you go into the official UN webpage. These documents are alive, living in the UN website. Next, we go to the next slide. So here's what it looks like when you click on the English version among the many other languages of the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia. First is there's a cover letter from the UN General Assembly and the UN Secretary General to the UN Secretary General, Javier Perez de Cuellar. So those are the three main organs of the United Nations. The United Nations has about 6 main organs. The other ones that are not relevant to this discussion is the International Court of Justice based in The Hague. It's relevant to Cambodia in another matter, the Vihear case with Thailand, but that's a separate topic altogether. There's ECOSOC, the Social and Economic Council, and then there's one other obscure that is slipping my my mind at the moment. But anyway, this letter, which is the cover letter to introduce, to present in a formal way the Paris Peace Agreements, the 4 documents, and we'll see it in a little bit, is on the letterhead with the insignia of the UN General Assembly, UNGA, UNGA, UN Security Council, UNSC, to the UN Secretariat, mainly the Secretary General, UNSG. His Excellency Javier Perez de Cuellar. So this is the cover letter, and I'm showing, I did this screenshot. It shows there are 50 pages in the English language. So the first page is, it's not part of the Paris Peace Agreements, but the next page, we begin the first document. So go on to the next slide. So here is, so this is now the first of 4 documents which form the Paris Peace Agreements, and it's the title there. As you can see, it's a font, type print from the 1990s or late 1991. So this is the best copy that the UN has. That is a PDF that has posted on its official website. So this is the first document, the final act of the Paris Conference on Cambodia. Here's the second document. Next page, next slide. Agreement on a comprehensive political settlement of the Cambodia conflict. This is the longest of the 4 documents, about 20 pages. Next slide. Well, and let me say 20 pages, not in this font and not in this print because it's longer. 20 pages in a present day, sort of if you do a Word document in present day, but it's longer here in this version. The third document, which is the core of the Paris Peace Agreements, and the title is Agreement Concerning the Sovereignty, Independence, Territorial Integrity and Inviolability, Neutrality, and National Unity of Cambodia. And that's about 5 pages of text, and it's legally binding. So you notice the term again, agreement, in each, in the title of document 2 and document 3. Next slide, please. And the fourth document of the Paris Peace Agreements, Declaration on the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction of Cambodia. And it's about a page and a half, 2 pages. It's very short. And it's basically, it uses the word declaration. It's basically a way to raise funds among the member countries, among the member states in the UN system for the reconstruction, for the rehabilitation, and then reconstruction of Cambodia. So now you have seen the actual Paris Peace Agreements in the English language from the UN website, the headings anyway. So now let's go and see a little bit more of the language of the actual Paris Peace Agreements of these 4 documents. Next slide. So here's the first document, the final act of the Paris Conference on Cambodia. Of course, it took place in Paris. There's the word Paris in the title. Paris then was known as a place for peace agreements. Now, of course, it's Norway. It's the country Norway. Before, it's France, who was known as the facilitator of peace agreements. Now, Norway has the niche. Okay, next slide. Here's some of the languages of the first document. And I'm giving these, I'm taking excerpts from the first document, the final act of the Paris Conference, to give you a sense of the gravity of the weight, the significance of the Paris peace agreements. This is the language of the document itself. The conference was held in 2 sessions. The first from July 30 to August 30, 1989. 1989, the first session. And the second from October 21 to October 23, 3 days, like the first session, in October 1991. So 2 years apart, both in Paris. The co-presidents of the conference, the meetings, these sessions, were Roland Dumas, Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, and Ali Alatas, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. One from Europe, one from the region, the superpower in Southeast Asia, Indonesia. The co-presidents convening these high-level meetings or sessions, what we call together the Paris Conference. The following states, countries, states in international law are countries, or countries in international law are known as states. The following states participated in the conference, in these 2 sessions, and actually other meetings as well. Australia, Brunei in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, the focus of the Paris Peace Agreements, Canada from North America, China, the superpower, a member of the a permanent member of the UN Security Council, France from Europe, the co-president, the host of the Paris Conference, another permanent member of the UN Security Council, India, the biggest democracy in the world, Indonesia, the co-president of the Paris Conference, a major power in Southeast Asia, a member of ASEAN then, because the membership then and now are very different. Japan, a major superpower in Asia. Laos, not a member of ASEAN then. Malaysia, a member of ASEAN then. Philippines, from Southeast Asia. I'm not sure if a member or not of ASEAN, but anyway, from Southeast Asia. Singapore, an emerging superpower and a member and a founding member of ASEAN. Thailand, another democracy and a founding member of ASEAN. USSR, the Soviet Union, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as well as the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. those four nations make up the country, the United Kingdom. I'm also a member of the UN Security Council. The United States, of course, a member of the UN Security Council, and very active in raising about the foreign occupation of Cambodia in the United Nations. And Vietnam, not mentioned as the occupying power over Cambodia, but understood. So those are the countries, and then there are, of course, within the blocks, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, the communist and the versus the free liberal countries. But then, as I've mentioned, there was also another portion, another block of the within of the world then, that was known as the non-aligned movement. In the first session in 1989, Zimbabwe was the president of the non-aligned movement, so it participated in the first session of the Paris Conference. In the second session, Yugoslavia was the president of the non-aligned movement, and so participated and is a signatory to the October 23, 1991 Paris Peace Agreements. And as you know, there is no more Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia has balkanized into different countries, different states, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, etc. So let's go back to the text again, enlarge it. So the next slide, please. This is still the language of the first document of the Paris agreements. Point 4, so and the point also is the actual numbering of the document. At the first session of the conference, Cambodia was represented by the 4 Cambodian parties. The Supreme National Council of Cambodia, under the leadership of its president, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, represented Cambodia at the second session of the conference. The first session occurred in 1989. There was a 2-year break because it made headway, but a lot were still not agreed upon yet. There hasn't been a comprehensive agreement on many things. So there was a period of 2 years where the UN Secretary General and the co-presidents held many smaller meetings and were jet-setting all over the world here and there to discuss with the General Assembly, UN Security Council mainly, and various other main players. And so you notice that at the first session, Cambodia were represented by 4 voices, 4 parties. But at the second session, there was unity now in 1991, and it was under the umbrella of the Supreme National Council, headed by Prince Norodom Sihanouk, later to be recrowned king. Okay, next slide, please. Just to emphasize the significance and the gravitas, the involvement of the world at its highest level in terms of countries and the dignitaries, in terms of presidents and foreign ministers and the UN system itself. And so here are the 3 major organs very actively involved from the time that Vietnam invaded Cambodia to the time of the signing of the Paris Peace Agreements to the actual administering of the elections, where 90% of the Cambodian registered voters showed up. Incredible. I mean, it's a really high rate of voter registration and voter turnout. And where Hun Sen lost, by the way, but we go to that point later. Let's go back to the large, yes. If you look at the UN, the six major organs of the United Nations, three of them, the main ones, are prominently, actively, consistently, continually, in a prolonged manner engaged with producing the Paris Peace Agreements. Okay, next page. Next slide. Here are some of the images. Let's see who they are. In the first tab, we see Javier Perez de Cuellar, the UN Secretary General. He's in the middle, and next to him is the French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas, and next to him, to the very right, is Prince Norodom Sihanouk. You know, they're laughing and they're standing for a group photo. In the bottom picture, we see the four Cambodian parties with the French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas. There's Khieu Samphan representing the Khmer Rouge, Son San representing the resistance force along the Thai border, a very powerful force of democratic voices. We see Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who has the greatest stature, and thus he was given the status of the president of the Supreme National Council because he is very close to China and he has the gravitas to ultimately bring the four Cambodian factions together. And then, of course, there's Hun Sen representing the military, the foreign occupying force of Vietnam. And then there's right again, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas, and Hun Sen in the handshake. Next image. Next slide, please. We continue at looking at the language of the first document. Point 5, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Javier Perez de Cuellar, pictured to the very left of Prince, to the very left, to the right of Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Mr. Javier Perez de Cuellar and his special representative, Mr. Rafiuddin Ahmed, also participated in the conference. Not at this point, they're very active, but they physically appeared and showed up, have presence at the conference. But of course, the Secretary General himself engaged himself throughout the whole process over about a decade long. 9.9. At the inaugural portion of the final meeting of the Paris Conference on 23rd October 1991, today is the 30th anniversary, thus this special seminar. The conference was addressed by Mr. Francois Mitterrand, President of the French Republic of France, by Prince Norodom Sihanouk, President of the Supreme National Council of Cambodia, and by Javier Perez de Cuellar, Secretary General of the United Nations. There's Prince Norodom Sihanouk pictured with the French President Mitterrand, he was president for a long time. I forgot how long he was president, but he's a very long-term president of France, not as long as our dear leader, Mr. Hun Sen, and he was elected legitimately. And of course, okay, anyway, let's not go too far off point. Next slide, please. I've taken a page from my translation and editing. I used it I worked off the old translation, let's put it this way, but my version of the Paris Peace Agreements in Khmer. So, but point number 13 in the first document gives you a flavor of the document. So thus I want to, and you to see it. The states, again, countries in international law, the states participating in the conference request the International Committee of the Red Cross to facilitate, in accordance with its principles, the release of prisoners of war and civilian internees. They express their readiness to assist the ICRC in this task. The first image is of Pain Sovan, the first prime minister in quotations, propped up by Vietnam. And because he refused to carry out the Vietnamization policies of the very prominent Vietnamese military and political officials of that time, Le Docteur was very present in Cambodia during those years and met with Pain Savan, met with Hun Sen on a regular basis. And Le Docteur, as you know, won the Nobel Peace Prize with Kissinger, but he refused. And when Kissinger shook his hand, he wiped it off to show his disdain. But anyway, I'm raising this point to show you who the Vietnamese dignitaries were in Cambodia during those years. They were of international stature. They had just won the war against the supreme superpower of the world, the United States. Thus, the exuberance, the boost, the moral boost to them. But Vietnam was completely depleted of resources and wealth. And of course, since then and now, Cambodia has been stripped, completely raped and plundered of its natural resources and wealth by many countries, mainly Vietnam. You know, the deforestation that is occurring in Cambodia in protected national parks are done by Vietnamese state companies. This is not my research. This is research by Global Witness and other environmental groups. But let's go back to this picture and this point. Let's enlarge the picture again. So that's Pain Savan. He was imprisoned. He was put because he refused to carry out the Vietnamization of Cambodia, the policies of Vietnamization to turn Cambodia into a province of Vietnam, to obliterate the state of Cambodia, the identity of Cambodian, the culture of Cambodia, to erase Cambodia from the map. He was arrested by Vietnam military. Hun Sen was there to arrest him along with Vietnamese military officials, and he was bundled up and taken up to Hanoi and put in solitary detainment indefinitely, if not for the Paris Peace Agreement. So this agreement calls for the release of not only Pain Savan, but other political prisoners of war. Prisoners of war. But I want to also raise and highlight the term civilian internees. There were major, gross mass crimes committed under the darkness of the military occupation of 12 to 14 years. And of course, very few reports by, there were very few human rights organizations. I don't even think by that time Human Rights Watch came to existence yet. But Amnesty International in 1987 spoke about the torture and the mistreatment of civilian prisoners, civilian detainees. So I want to juxtapose the picture of a political prisoner from that time with the political prisoners of present day, young environmentalists who are advocating for the environments, to protect national parks. They're being detained right now. So these are the images. I used to have images of them all over my house for other live streaming talks. But here are the images, the past and the present, meaning that the issue of the Paris Peace Agreements, the letter, the spirit, the language, the letter, the language, the spirit, the goal, the intent, the objective of the Paris Peace Agreements are very much alive and urgent for us Cambodians and Cambodia. Next slide. Just again to remind you of the geopolitical context and the time frame. We're talking about the two tragic events which are addressed by the Paris Peace Agreements, really also the US bombings previous to that. But I want to draw attention to these two periods, the Khmer Rouge era, which everyone is stuck there. They can't think outside of that, and being stuck and focusing solely on the Khmer Rouge has given cover to mass crimes by Vietnam of Cambodia and Vietnamization. And now China, but China is overt. Vietnam is still a fifth column, is still surreptitious, even though it has gained confidence in being more open in its presence in Cambodia. Let's go back to this time frame a minute, enlarge it. I want to bring back this page, this time slide from before, because I want to remind you that it's just more than addressing the human rights issues, the recent event that was the Khmer Rouge years. The Paris Peace Agreements, first and foremost, was to address the foreign occupation of Cambodia, and then, of course, all the major other topics of elections, of human rights, of democracy, of prisoners of wars, of refugees, of displaced persons. And we'll see the language for that in the subtitles. But as you saw in the main titles of the four documents, it's the preoccupation, the foremost preoccupation was the foreign occupation of Cambodia. But in the public domain now, from then till now, we don't discuss, we don't address, we don't know about the 12 to 14 years of military occupation that produced multiple genocides and mass crimes. And we, what I have gathered from the of the limited writings on that era, I have put it in a systematic form is only, and what I'm telling you now is only scratching the surface. It's still very, very dark. I'm putting the figure $2.4 billion was the amount for the UNTAC commission. We're not talking about, we're not even, I don't think that figure includes all the expenses of all the major meetings, all the five-star hotels, all the airfares, and of hundreds of individuals involved, which led to the Paris Peace Agreements, which led to UNTAC, the mission that cost $2.4 billion, unprecedented in UN history. And in today's money, that's $5 billion. But I think money is a lot more valuable than $5 billion today. That was the exchange that I did on Google. But can you imagine? When I was in college, coffee was 25 cents. In 1991, that was my first year of Georgetown. When this was happening, I was reading, tears streaming down my eyes. Every day on the front page of the Washington Post, the Paris Peace Agreements, the events leading up to it, the discussions. And then, of course, through my 4 years at Georgetown as an undergrad, studying international politics. Madeleine Albright was there, was a professor there as well. I didn't have her. I only had Jean Kirkpatrick, who was her predecessor at the United Nations. Anyway, where was I going with this? Oh, I want to say that the money is probably, the translation is 5 billion in today's currency, but I think it's a lot more valuable than and then, because money was very, very valuable then. Next slide. So, excuse me. Here are some of the articles and writings published in the English language by prominent writers, internationally renowned, award-winning writers like Elizabeth Becker, Stephen Morris, Steve Heder, names of experts we can trust on Cambodia. So these articles of the very, very rare ones, which exist either in digital, in physical form in a library somewhere in the world, or in now digitalized, but difficult to access because you need code or you need subscription. So I've been able to glean some of them to give you a sense of this period of almost complete darkness. As I've said, the Khmer Rouge years now, we have so many writings on it, and films and testimonies, and people are free to speak about it because we have survivors who are free to speak about it, and it jives with international sentiments to be able to speak about it because everyone's interested about it. Everyone encourages this discussion. Not so with the period of Vietnamese occupation. One, as I've said, very few resources. Two, Vietnam has been shrewdly successful in turning the table and placing the blame and the burden on the Cambodian people as racist based solely on the word, one single word, Yuen, which means Vietnam or Vietnamese in the Khmer language, which is the only word we know until recently, or until in recent memory. And it's also the word used by Thai for the Vietnamese, but it's only considered wrongly racist on Cambodians when Cambodians used it. So I've addressed these issues. I've addressed a little bit of the psychology from a lay person's perspective to understand why there was such an obstacle in wanting to understand and know about, or the lack of understanding for this dark period. So please go to my webpage. It's intensive, but it's only scratching the surface. But there are a lot of writings on them, and you need to on my webpage itself, I give you excerpts to give you a narrative to counter the very predominant wrong narrative that has been very costly to Cambodia and Cambodians, and painting us as racist. To address that, and in giving cover for Vietnam to commit mass crimes before and the continuation of Vietnamization, despite and in spite the presence of now China. And as you notice, one of the 7 parts of Vietnamization is China responds. You know, we saw that there was a major shift in 2012 when China overtly interfered, when Cambodia was the president, was the chair of ASEAN in ASEAN affairs, when Cambodia was told by China and followed China's order not to issue a communique about the conflict in the South China Seas, which involved many members of ASEAN. So please go to my webpage, which is very simple, thearyseng.com, and right away you will see a box, right? Always at whatever page you go to, but when you go into my page to my website, push on published articles regarding Vietnamization. You can't miss it. And then you will be able to read the published writings of this very, very dark period. It's only scratching the surface, but I hope you will help and I hope you will be open-minded to uh, to allow a competing narrative to your current understanding of the situation, or lack of understanding, because there hasn't been much written about it. People completely skipped and they go from the Khmer Rouge era to the present day, completely skipping those 14 years of occupation. So anyway, so I'm giving you the link now. Go read these articles after reading, of course, the Paris Peace Agreements first. Not very long. In font in Word document today is only about 22 pages. In the UN website, which is very difficult to read, go to USIP. USIP has a more accessible version, and that's only about 22 pages, whereas the UN website has, the PDF old font, which is difficult to read. Okay, enough about drawing your attention to this page of my website, but do go there after you read the Paris Peace Agreements. Next slide. So during this time period, the time frame I showed you, the 5 decades, but really focusing on the decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In recent, immediately, these are documents from the CIA, of the Defense Agency of the United States, which addresses the military occupation of Cambodia. It's really incredible. They were confidential documents, and they have only been declassified maybe about 10 years ago, 7, 8, 10 years ago, meaning that way after the signing of the Paris Peace Agreements. But now they're available. You can read them in full, and I encourage them to read them from my web page, or go into my my Facebook page. Go into album. I have posted the documents in full in the album section of my Facebook, or go into my webpage, the link that I gave earlier. Okay, next slide. So here are some of the excerpts to give you a taste of what is not known in the public domain. But now I have grouped together in my webpage. Here, these are excerpts, these are quotes, and I give you the reference as well. François Ponchot, a French Jesuit who had diligently chronicled the destructiveness of the Khmer Rouge in his book Cambodia Year Zero, maintained that the Vietnamese were conducting a new, subtle genocide against the Cambodian people. This is an article in the Washington Post by William Shawcross, a prominent writer of global renown, now living in the UK. He may be British, but I know that he's now in the UK. And he wrote the seminal book Sideshow, which gave a detailed account of the U.S. Bombings of Cambodia. Back to the large screen. According to the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, the Vietnamese invasion and food embargo caused 700,000 deaths in Cambodia in 1979. 1979 is the first year of Vietnamese military occupation of Cambodia. And this is an article written by Stephen Morris, a prominent researcher, academician, an Australian, a friend of Cambodia, who wrote the book Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia, and has been translated into Khmer, Why Vietnam Liberated Cambodia. Stephen is a friend, and this article was in the Harvard International Review in 1981. At present, 200,000 Vietnamese soldiers occupy Cambodia. Behind them, following a policy dictated by Hanoi, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese are beginning to establish themselves in the country, Cambodia. In history, there are few more obvious examples of a final solution devised to blot out a national and ethnic identity. The Cambodians are now being absorbed. James Webb in the Washington Post, April 14, 1983. And 1983 is the crescendoing of the K5 genocide. It would peak in 1985, 1986, 1987, when Hun Sen replaced Chun Si, who was murdered in Moscow, as prime minister in January 1985. We saw a peak in numbers of death from the K5 genocide. Back to the slide, enlarging. Next slide. This is still from the published writings that I have I've gleaned and put together on my web page. Here's some more of the writings in, as you can see, very established sources by prominent writers. So no, it's really difficult to argue and to disagree with these established experts, globally renowned. Work on what the Cambodians called the K5 project was essentially slave labor. Something, I think the logo needs to be taken off, something about conditions in the malaria-infested and heavily mined border regions, slave labor, and conditions in the malaria infested and heavily mined. As you know, Cambodia was the most mined countries in the world, especially along the border, the 700 kilometers border with Thailand. It was the most heavy, and that's where all the men were being pushed to build the bamboo wall. Enlarge the text. We will continue reading. So let's, and conditions of the malaria infested and heavily mined border regions were appalling and dangerous. A minimum of 50,000 volunteers were estimated to have succumbed to yellow fever alone by the end of 1986, prompting one Western observer to refer to the campaign as the new genocide. As we know, the figures are a lot higher. And I have other writings, published writings, which on this, so go to the page and read. Especially, yeah. So the requisitioning of civilians started in September 1984, but we know that's not true because Pain Savan gave the date earlier about the K5 plan, the K5 genocide, when Le Docteur came to him. So it didn't start in September 1984. We know from Pain Savan and mainly from Pain Savan, let's put it this way, that it started as early, I think it's 1981 or 82 when Le Docteur came to talk with him, and he addressed the K5 and raised the K5 plan. So as you know, as I've said, these are snippets and in a very, very dark area, in a very, very dark period. So we don't have a lot of competing narratives or research. We only have glimpses. But this gives you a glimpse of the gravity, of the magnitude, the scope of the lives lost. And it's a lot higher than this. And it started a lot longer than 84, since Pain Savan. The requisitioning of civilians started in September 1984. The Cambodians often refer to the departure of the clearing duty as a new April 17. April 17, 1975 marks the entry of the Khmer Rouge in Phnom Penh. The K5 plan, described by some people as a new genocide, made tens of thousands of victims, put it in the hundreds, if not millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who died, who succumbed. But we don't know because it took place almost a whole decade of the 1980s. We continue. I enlarge the text. That's the reference. It's from a translation of the French article published in La Libre Belgique in 1986. Excuse me a minute. During our outings in the provinces, it was rarer and rarer to see men tilling the fields, and most of the time, women planted, bedded plants, or harvested on their own. Dr. Esmeralda Lucioli, Le Maire de Bamboo, the Bamboo Wall. She was a medical doctor with Doctors Without Borders. And again, they had travel restrictions, but nonetheless, she wrote a book in French. Now it's out of print. It's been, excerpts of it have been translated into English, but difficult to find. Again, speaking to the darkness of the era and the mass crimes, and we're only scratching the surface. Enlarge the print. At the end of the Cambodia's war, there were entire villages which had no men. And I heard this and I saw this. I was in church here in Phnom Penh, in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, when this Christian missionary was speaking that day, and I snapped. He was giving a slideshow, and this is a text that was on there, and I snapped it. He said it, and I have a picture of this. But the reference there may be again to the Khmer Rouge years. But as you know, genocide, legal, when we speak about genocide, we speak generally to express the incomprehensible horror of the tragedy, understandable, but there's also legal genocide, which has conditions and has to meet certain criteria. What I'm talking about now is legal genocide by Vietnam, one of many during occupation. So when you target men, you want to destroy a people. Huh? And here we have two accounts by Dr. Esmeralda Lucioli, and we have a Christian pastor years later who were eyewitness of seeing no men in Cambodia, because the men have been chased down and ground up and sent in the hundreds of thousands over a period of a decade, almost a decade, to the border region where malaria was eating up everybody, and mines were destroying everybody. Back to the slide, enlarge. Next slide. Here's the last excerpt from the webpage of the published writings that I've collected. For 10 years, the Vietnamese tried to apply to Cambodia a policy of ethnocide, the destruction of a culture within those who carry it, insidiously carried out, particularly in the beginning in the educational domain. This is from a book that has been just brilliantly translated from French to English. I've read it in English. I have not seen the French version. I've not read the French version. The author has since passed away. She has been and knows Cambodia. She had been and knew Cambodia since the 1950s, 60s as an anthropologist. Then she became the director of a research think tank in Paris on Asia. And then she wrote this amazing book with a long chapter on the occupation of Cambodia and the resistance to it. And the English title is The Cambodia, a Shattered Society. If you can get a hold of a copy of this book, it's one of the top 4 or 5 books to read on Cambodia. The first is by Elizabeth Becker, When the War Was Over, which also speaks, has a chapter on occupation and speaks and also addresses demographic Vietnamization in detail. So the first book on Cambodia, among the hundreds of books on Cambodia, the first number one is Elizabeth Becker's book, When the War Was Over. And if you are interested in the biography of Pol Pot, David Chandler is always a good person to read, especially prior to the Khmer Rouge. The expert on the Khmer Rouge is Steve Heder. Um, where was I? Oh, Elizabeth Becker. And then the second book is an autobiography of Pol Pot. By a British journalist. His name, I've met him when he was here in Cambodia. He attended a conference that we had of all the authors. It's a biography of Pol Pot. I have it. It's in my web page. I mentioned this. And he addresses the genocide issue as well, the legal genocide versus the non-legal genocide, and the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, how that is using and falling prey into this narrative that is very, very costly and destructive to Cambodia and to Cambodians. But anyway, back to this this slide. So, here's the title in it's only the title in English. The title in French is a little bit different. It's by Marie Alexandrine Martin. And from chapter 8, the Vietnamese occupation and the resistance. And it's been brilliantly translated into English. This is the English version that was published by the University of California Press. So really substantial, because as you know, the UC system is amazing. It's very, very substantial. Published in 1989, republished, reissued in 1994. Okay. So this is the time period that we're speaking about. This is the core of why there's a Paris Peace Agreements, even before the Khmer Rouge years. Next slide. Oh, I have to rush now. My goodness, it's 2 hours already. So we'll take another 20 minutes, and I promise. Because now we're into the remember there are 4 documents which together officially, these 4 official documents form what we generally call the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia. The number 2 and number 3, the middle 2 documents are the core. They're the legally binding language. The legally binding language of commitments, of enforcement, of legal enforcement are found in document 2, this one, Agreement on a Comprehensive Political Settlement of the Cambodian Conflict, and document 3 on the agreement concerning the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and its inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia. The core of using legally binding language. But let's look briefly at the language, the text of document 2, which is the longest, about 20 pages. So here we see Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Hun Sen was in awe of Sihanouk, as you can imagine. He was this young upstart, groomed by the Vietnamese officials over the years, and now meeting Sihanouk, being at this international conference. But now, as you know, he's the kingmaker, and Sihanouk is no longer here, and the current king is not the king. Let's put it this way. Okay, so Sihanouk. Hun Sen is the kingmaker, is the what I want to communicate. Next page. So we're going to now look at some of the languages of the article of document 2, which is the heart of the Paris Peace Agreement. So here's the preamble to give a sense. In the presence of the Secretary General of the United Nations, to give gravitas, who's there, that this is really substantial. So he's a witness. The other parties are parties. They're binding on those other parties who are countries and nations. Whereas in the presence of the Secretary General, he's a witness. He's witnessing this to give gravitas. He's lending his good offices. In order to maintain, preserve, and defend the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia, is literally the title of the third document. This language is used again and again and again. I think in all the four documents, and of course in all the resolutions leading up to the Paris Peace Agreements, emerging out of the UN, in the UN Security Council, in various other resolutions. Desiring to restore and maintain peace in Cambodia, to promote national reconciliation, and to ensure the exercise of the right to self-determination of the Cambodian people through free and fair elections. So the focus is free and fair elections, but also there's another focus undergirding that, which goes back to the sovereignty, self-determination, independence, territorial integrity of Cambodia and Cambodians as a nation. So the focus is elections, the means, the mode, in order to ensure that the will of the Cambodian people and the self-determination, the sovereignty, the independence of Cambodia and Cambodians are maintained and respected. Next, not next, so stay on this page. Convinced that only a comprehensive political settlement to the Cambodian conflict will be just and durable and will contribute to regional and international peace and security. Look at the highlight. So these are countries who are participating, yes, for the welfare of Cambodia and Cambodians, but also they're thinking about their own national interests, their own security, their own stability, their own peace in the international community. When a country invades another country, that creates instability and it must end. It must be based on rule of law. The international community must be rules-based. This is the message that it is sending. Next. This is still the preamble to the second document, which is the heart of the matter, noting the statements made at the conclusion of the meeting held in Jakarta, in Jakarta, September 1990, in Paris, December 1990, in Pattaya, June 1991, in Beijing, July 1991, in Pattaya, August 1991, also meetings held in Jakarta, June 1991, and New York, September 1991. I put this excerpt in there to underscore the significance of the Paris Peace Agreements. All the different meetings, and these meetings don't even mention all the closed door behind closed door meetings among the dignitaries of the UN system, the Secretary General himself, with all the major players of the UN Security Council, with the heads of states of the prominent countries, states that are involved with the Paris Peace Agreements. These are some of the meetings that are more prominent, but there were so many other more meetings of smaller nature, of confidential nature, but these are the public, more larger gatherings that could be mentioned. So you can imagine the jet setting, and we're talking about 1980s. It's a completely different era of travel where it's expensive, and so again, and this is this is not in the 2.4 billion budget for UNTAC and the mission in Cambodia. This is all prior. So the budget and the expenses over periods of time, over years, over a decade, which resulted in the Paris Peace Agreements. And as you know, the first session occurred in 1989. That was when the Cold War began to thaw. So the Paris Peace Agreement is a legal document, but we're working in the political context, in a geopolitical context, the constraint. I'm asked often, especially by Cambodians, why, if we have this legal document, why can't we use it? Is it dead? No, it's not dead. It's just that the political context is very, very restrained, is very, very difficult, but it's doable. So when the Cold War started to thaw, all of a sudden the first session came about, and then the Paris Peace Agreement in October 1991, and then the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was funding Vietnam, its satellite, in occupying Cambodia. Thus, the opening. So now, last night I was on Radio Free Asia, and in the Khmer language, I'm asked often why, if it's legal, if it's still relevant, if it's living, if it's a living document, why can't we use it? Why can't we? And we can. It's this is why we need to advocate. We need to have these seminars. We need to have a fuller, correct understanding, and first of all, to understand the context when no one knows about the occupation years. It's really hard to advocate, and we Cambodians advocate. We're slapped down as racist. It's so this is why we need to change the narrative by through education. Thus, my contribution in creating these seminars now in the English language. So let's enlarge the text again. Welcoming, this is still the preamble. They're sort of like setting the stage, noting, welcoming, giving the scene before going to why the parties have agreed, are committed to this, and it's enforceable. Welcoming United Nations Security Council resolution, a decision 717 of 16 October 1991 on Cambodia, recognizing Cambodia's tragic recent history. Recent means not the Khmer Rouge. Recent is the occupation years. History requires special measures to assure protection of human rights and the non-return to the policies and practices of the past. But recent is, of course, also includes the Khmer Rouge, but even more recent than the Khmer Rouge that has been overlooked, the 14 years of military occupation. And it can also, the recent, of course, can also include the US bombings. Next. So here is the table of contents. We're not going to go anymore into the language, but I want to give you the table of contents, the contents of the document 2, the longest document, the heart of the matter, the agreement on a comprehensive political settlement. So the first part speaks about the arrangements during the transitional period, in Cambodia. Okay, how are we about to do this? Section 1 speaks about the transitional period. Section 2, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, acronym UNTAC, also known by Cambodians as UNTAC. Section 3, Supreme National Council, headed by Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Section 4, withdrawal of foreign forces and its verification. Again, the heart of the matter, foreign occupation must end. Section 5, ceasefire and cessation of outside military assistance. Again, foreign powers, not only Vietnam, but China funding the Khmer Rouge. Part 2, elections. Part 3, human rights. Here, it addresses the Khmer Rouge years, it addresses the occupation years. Part 4, international guarantees. Part 5, refugees and displaced persons. Next slide. Part 6, this is still of the second document, the core of the document, the longest, about 20 pages. Release of prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Part 7, principles for a new constitution for Cambodia. Part 8, rehabilitation and reconstruction, which is also a title of the fourth document, declaration on the rehabilitation and reconstruction, and parts 9, sort of like the final provisions, the signing and where it was done, the date and all of that. And then the annexes. The annexes gives details, fleshes out the annexes flesh out what has been addressed in the main article, in the main document 2, in the agreement. Now it tells and gives details of how to carry out these things. Annex 1 of the document 2 of the political settlement, UNTAC mandate. Annex 2, withdrawal, ceasefire, and related measures. Article Annex I don't know why I have investigation. Oh, that's because Article 10 under Article 2 has investigation of violations of the withdrawal. If it refuses to withdraw, if Vietnam refuses to withdraw, if China continues to fund the Khmer Rouge, continues to give arms to the Khmer Rouge. Annex 3, elections. Annex 5, principles for a new constitution for Cambodia. Next page, we'll go fast now because in May 1993, UNTAC administered the elections. There was 90% voter turnout. Hun Sen lost majorly with only 38% of the votes, despite the violence, despite the intimidation, despite the harassment, despite that it had the apparatus, the military apparatus all over the country. It still lost. Next page. Okay, document 3. Document 3, another core. We're almost done. We're in 5 more minutes. We're almost done. Document 3, agreement concerning the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia. And of course, it addresses Vietnam, the occupation power, but also China that was arming the Khmer Rouge. Next page. Next slide. Here's the preamble of this document, the third document, which is about 3-4 pages. In the presence of the Secretary General of the United Nations, again, he's witnessing this to give gravitas, convinced that a comprehensive political settlement for Cambodia is essential for the long-term objective of maintaining peace and security in Southeast Asia. The document 2 speaks about international peace and security generally. Document 3, when it speaks about invasion, sovereignty, independence, it mentions Southeast Asia specifically. Singapore was concerned for its own welfare because it's this tiny city state surrounded by Malaysia, a giant, surrounded by Indonesia, a giant. If the international community allows a larger country to invade and occupy a smaller country, well, sooner or later, a larger country may invade Singapore. And Singapore is just this tiny island state. So it's very concerned. And I had the really honored opportunity to speak in person with Professor Chan Heng Chi. She's a dignitary in Singapore. She was a professor for many years, then worked in the United Nations. And then I met her when she was ambassador from Singapore to the United States in Washington, D.C. I first met her, I think at least once, via Cambodian ambassador Rolong Eng. And then when Stephen Solars, who of course is a friend of Madame Chan Heng Chi, I got to meet and to talk with a U.S. representative from New York, Stephen Solars, a friend of Cambodia. He has passed away now. When he heard that I was in the area during Thanksgiving, and Professor Chan, Ambassador Chan Cheng He was also in Washington, D.C. During Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is a family holiday. And she doesn't have her family. She's when I met her, that she was not married. And of course, then I was not married. And I was trying to think who I was dating then. I know, different story. Now, but the whole point was that it's a family holiday, and so Stephen Solars wanted us to meet as well, because in knowing that she had worked very prominently on Cambodia, and here's this, she's of a different generation than me, and here's this a young Cambodian, me then young. So he invited us, so generous. He invited um, Ambassador Chan Cheng Hee and me to spend Thanksgiving dinner with his family in McLean, Virginia, which is this wealthy suburb near Washington, D.C. And he asked that the ambassador gave me a ride because I didn't have a car then. I used the public transportation. Washington, D.C. is very easy to use public transportation. So she gave me a ride, and so it gave us a lot of time to talk. I had met her again before, as I've said, via Ambassador Roland Ng. Anyway, my point is that from her directly, and from what I have researched on my own, from my former studies and my own personal interests, Singapore was interested in protecting its own national interest, in advocating very strongly for a rules-based international system. Thailand did not want communism on its border. Cambodia was a buffer. It wanted Cambodia as a country that is not communist, not subsumed by Vietnam, and become a province of Vietnam, so that it communism on its borders. So Thailand was also aggressively against the occupation of Cambodia by Vietnam. Indonesia, of course, is the biggest democracy in the region, and was also very interested in this. But the focus on Southeast Asia, when in the third document that speaks about sovereignty and foreign occupation, is interesting. Is what I want you to note. Is what why I'm highlighting this. Principles of non-interference, international peace and security, the will of the peoples, there can be no outside interference, subversion, coercion, or threat. Okay, so this is the language of the preamble leading into what will be agreed, a contract among the parties, not only the 4 Cambodian parties, the 18 other countries who are signatories, who are not witnesses. The Secretary General of the UN was a witness. The other countries are parties, signatories to this agreement on Cambodia. And this document, along with the second document, commits each of them to carry out their duties and responsibilities in law. So this is a contract, an agreement, a commitment, and legally enforceable, legally binding. Next slide. So Article 1 speaks about Cambodia's duty to preserve and maintain, not to go invading other countries. But Article 2 speaks about the countries, the 18 countries who signed the Paris Peace Agreements to do this. Now, this is what has been agreed, and this is what the signatories, the 18 other countries, have committed themselves legally to doing. And it's a legal commitment. It's a legal, it's a legal commitment. So let's read some of them, the languages. Enlarge it. The other parties, not witnesses, the other parties, the 18 other signatories, countries to this agreement hereby solemnly undertake, commits, promises to recognize and to respect in every way the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia. We see this phrase repeated time and time again in the Paris Peace Agreements, the 4 documents, and in prior UN resolutions. And then it talks in more details about 5 or 6 subpoints. Next, because we're out of time, Article 3 speaks about all persons in Cambodia shall enjoy the rights and freedom embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other relevant international human rights instruments Cambodia undertakes and other parties again undertakes. So the Cambodia and the Cambodian parties undertake promises, commit themselves to these, but then the other parties refer to the 18 other countries signatories. So this Paris Peace Agreement is not binding only on the 4 Cambodian factions on Cambodia, but it is a legal document that is binding, that is enforceable on the signatories, the other 18 countries who are parties, not witnesses, also witnesses, but prominently parties to this Paris Peace Agreement. Next slide. And then the last document is just, let's enlarge it. Declaration on the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction of Cambodia. There's no commitment. It's sort of like a contribution. It's an urgent call for contribution. So a commitment, a legal commitment is a party promises to do that. The law can bind, can enforce it. Whereas a declaration is sort of like, well, if you can contribute, there's a call to contribute, but if you don't contribute $1 million, if France doesn't contribute $1 million to the reconstruction of Cambodia, there's no legally binding that says you have to, France. It's a declaration, it's an urgent call, a request for contribution to the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Cambodia and the phases and how the UN system, which is like an umbrella, 193 member states, countries, and then all the organs, all the programs, all the specialized agencies like the World Bank, the IMF, the ADB, the whole UN system will be actively engaged in the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Cambodia. Again, to emphasize the magnitude, the comprehensiveness of the Paris Peace Agreements from every angle and the unprecedented nature of the UN in playing such a role as UNTAC, and the number of countries and who are involved, the dignitaries, the individuals involved, reflect the gravitas, the significance, the inability to erase or to kill the Paris Peace Agreements. Next slide. Can we enlarge it? Here's just an example of the text of the last document, which is very short. The United Nations will be involved, an appeal for contributions, and there'll be another body that will be created. It's called the International Committee on the Reconstruction of Cambodia. The United Nations Secretary General, again, is mentioned, is very active, and in personally using his good offices to request to make arrangements, special arrangements for the United Nations system to support for a smooth transition from rehabilitation to reconstruction phases. Next slide. The end. So you have now seen the Paris Peace Agreements and have now hopefully understand that the old narrative that is only to address the Khmer Rouge years of 3 years, 8 months, 20 days is a narrative that is skewed, that is manipulated at times, and that it has been very, very costly for Cambodia and Cambodians. Please read the text itself. It's very short. The whole Paris Peace Agreements are very short, a total of only 22 pages in today's font and and Word document. Go to USIP, United States something for Peace, Institute for Peace. It has the text that is accessible in the English language to read. Wow, this is a marathon. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes. So sorry, but I hope you have learned something. So have a good day. I will be continuing the Khmer special seminar and the special seminar on the Paris Peace Agreements in the Khmer language until we have read the whole 4 documents word by word to the very end, and along the way I explain. So if you also know Khmer and are interested in knowing more and fleshing out further the Paris Peace Agreements, there's a special seminar in the Khmer language continuing tonight at 7:45. It will be lesson 3, and we will be focusing on document 2, which is the heart of the matter. Thank you. Have a good day. Stay safe. 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements. Happy anniversary, everyone. Please read if you know Khmer. Please read if you can read in English or French or Arab or Russian or Chinese. All these languages have translated officially with the United Nations, the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia. Have a good day. God bless you.